Hey everyone, we're really excited about today's episode. Today we're going to be talking about our founder, Erin, Erin's story. I'm Katie, and I'm a holistic relationship coach.
And I'm Erin, the founder of Inner RAE. Let's dive in.
All right, I can't wait. All right, Erin, you are one of the most impressive, wonderful people I have ever met. And when we got reunited, we spent about 4 or 5 hours just catching up on our lives and getting to share our authentic stories. And so I'm so excited today to get to ask you some questions so that you can share with the audience where you've come from and how you've become such a living example of what radiant, authentic energy looks like in the world. So to start, I want to know what it was like to be a little air bear as a child. What were you like?
Oh, trip down memory lane. Here we go. So, yeah, I can paint this picture pretty clearly. I was a very serious child. And while that is cute and funny, and people often called me precocious, and adults would tell me that talking to me or spending time with me was like being with an adult. Many of you listening, and what I've come to find is that was definitely a trauma response. So, I was the oldest child. I grew up in a home that had, like so many homes, a lot of dysfunction. And I've done a lot of work around my family. So if you're listening and you haven't done that work, just know that this is not how I used to tell the story, but this is how I tell the story today, having processed and grieved and released a lot of pain and trauma around the part of the story I'm going to share. But so if it sounds flippant or not charged, it's just because I've done a lot of work to release the energy around this part of my story. So with that caveat, I'll just dive in. My dad struggled with alcoholism, sex addiction. He had lots of affairs and affairs with women who were close to our family. So it was pretty disruptive because we would have these aunts or these best friends of my mom's, and then they would just be gone. I was born in Los Angeles, and just to paint a little picture, I was born in the 80s in Los Angeles. The Rodney King riots happened while I was a kid, like in my neighborhood. So my home was filled with lots of partying. One of the taglines in my childhood home, like if I, how we can think of, oh, this is a tagline for the, Netflix movie about my childhood, would be interesting over safe. So because of that, as you can imagine, if the picture I just painted, oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, I have a younger brother. He's 14 months younger than me. We may or may not talk about him, but the tagline of interesting over safe produced a very, very serious little girl that, in order to feel safe, had to be the adult in the home. And again, I love my parents. I think that they are brilliant, interesting, good-hearted people who were living their best lives, and having children didn't change that for them. Sorry, just got distracted. Something fell in my house, probably one of my pets. So, or maybe that was the spirit of my grandma coming to be like, don't talk about that. Anyway, it kind of scared me.
Whoa, interesting timing.
And anyway, thanks, Grandma. I'm very, very close to my grandma, and she died in 2020. So it's possible that she was interjecting there. So anyway, I was a very serious child. In fact, one of my nicknames in preschool was Granny because I would stop kids in the playground and be like, oh, you need to tie your shoe, or don't run so fast, or, whatever. And I also had this resistance or inability to express myself creatively. So everything was about information, knowledge, structure, rules. And, maybe we'll have a whole episode at some point about the second chakra and like how that's related to the kind of trauma I experienced. But so I was very serious. I was very structured. I was stubborn. I was always right, which I don't know how a child could know everything. But in me, there was also this deep sense of shame that I carried everywhere. And there's an acronym for shame that really applies to my experience as a child, which is should have already mastered everything. If I did not know something, it was an automatic shame response. And I would try to hide it from you. So that was a big piece of who I was as a child. Another big piece was that my parents always had NPR on in every room. And I've come to find out that my dad has some ringing in his ears from his younger days of being in a rock band and whatever. But I remember being like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years old and hearing this story on NPR. They always tell these like stories of, people across the globe. And I think it was these children, maybe in Serbia or Bosnia. I don't remember where they were because I was too young to understand context. I think the first Bush was president. And I just remember being this little kid and being like, I'm going to grow up and help these people. Like I walked around with the weight of the world on my shoulders at all times. And I also remember fantasizing what it would be like to not have all that pressure all the time. Which when we talk about my teenage years makes that part make a little more sense. So yeah, I was very academically inclined. I got a lot of validation and nurturing from teachers. My second grade teacher was Ann Ifikenigwe. I remember because I was really proud of myself. She had us all like memorize how to spell her name. She was ethnically from Nigeria.
Wow.
And she told my parents that I was going to be a scientist. And I really took that on. And those of you who know me or who will know me at the end of this podcast know I did go on to become a scientist. So that part of me, that need to control the environment, to measure outcomes, that was instilled in me very young, and it was absolutely for survival. On the more kind of positive side, I loved music. Music was always a huge escape for me. Or I would say a refuge more than an escape. But of course, my favorite music back then was Diana Ross and the Supremes, Sam Cooke, Janet Jackson, Madonna. My parents really loved, so my dad's British and my mom's Jewish and from Milwaukee. And so they were very much of the rock and roll generation. But there was always a lot of reggae playing. But for me, that like Motown music, I mean, little did I know I was going to be a little love addict in training, but that Motown music just really, really captured me. And I resonated with it. I listen to the lyrics now and I'm like, wow, that's so interesting that I was so drawn to this music.
Yeah.
So anyway, does that paint a picture of me as a child?
Oh yeah, I got a clear picture of little Air Bear. I'm curious what then that transition was like from little child into teenage Erin. And what are some of the things that came up for you, and how did you learn to deal with those things as they arose?
So I think what is interesting about my story, and I've seen this with a lot of my clients, is I moved when I was 9.5, almost 10. I moved from central Los Angeles, where I was the only white girl in my grade in elementary school. Like there were some other people with like white or European skin, but I was like the only traditionally like completely white girl in my public school. And then I moved to Eastern Kentucky, where the culture was very different. We moved to Mays Lick, MAY'(S), new word, LICK, Mays Lick, Kentucky. You can look it up. Very small town, about 20 minutes from the actual city, which was a very small city called Maysville. And I bring that up because that is when my adolescent self developed. Because even though for many people it is more chronologically like 13 years old, my teenage self had to develop a lot earlier, because I went as much as like my childhood was dangerous and I developed this like need to be adult like. There were people in my life when I was a little girl in LA who really cared about me. Like my godmother was a consistent force. There were neighbors, there were friends, there were the parents of my friends who really looked out for me, nurtured me in ways that my mom and dad were not available for. We had nannies that cared about us. So there was this loving force in my life when we lived in LA, despite all the craziness. When we moved to Kentucky, those were the dark years. So my mom was depressed because she had left an environment where all her friends were. My dad's drinking had actually escalated. So it was like a classic tale of an alcoholic where, oh, let's do a geographical cure. But really what we've done is isolated the family system from the support. And, you know, as you can imagine, in Eastern Kentucky, a British alcoholic, a Jewish mother, which by the way, my parents are international gemstone dealers. So they did not fit into the culture of Eastern Kentucky. So you take our family out of LA, put us in this like almost foreign country, like third world. I don't mean third world like Kentucky is bad, but it's a very poor state. The running commentary in my school was that people like the adults thought my parents were drug dealers because we weren't allowed to talk about what we did. That was like our conditioning from being in Los Angeles. Like, don't tell people you're gemstone dealers. It could make you a target of a robbery. But what they figured out later is they had to tell people in Kentucky what they did. Otherwise, the assumptions were worse.
Right.
Like, we're mafia, we're drug dealers, we're this, we're that.
Whoa.
And so we moved to this like very different environment. And, you know, I didn't have a church that I went to. I didn't have cousins. I honestly couldn't even understand the dialect or the accents. So I developed this very brazen, angry, aggressive, skillful chameleon teenager self. And, you know, she was popular. She was, incredibly good at school. She knew how to change her personality based on who was in the room. By the time I was 17, I think I had like 4 or 5 distinct personas that I would shuffle through. So much so that at my high school graduation party, I like had a intellectual like glitch, and I invited all these people and they all showed up, and I realized that like they all knew a different version of me. And I literally had a meltdown and like got super wasted and passed out at my own party because I could not handle the fact that I had these 4 or 5 personas I was trying to manage.
Right.
So yeah, I started doing drugs and drinking alcohol around 11, 10, 11, probably becoming an every weekend thing by 12. And more regularly after that. It never became something like I had this commitment to academics that pretty much I had a commitment in middle school. I asked my parents, I said, if I get straight A's, can I go to college anywhere I want? And they made me an agreement. They were like, absolutely, we'll make it happen. Anywhere you want to go, anywhere you get into, no matter what the cost, we'll make it happen. And so I refrained from doing drugs or drinking actually during school hours or in any setting that could compromise my ability to get into a good college. So I'm what I would call a high functioning addict, or someone that leans towards over control versus under control when it comes to, you know, medicating how I'm feeling. So yeah, so that was my teenage self. Highly over controlled, eating disorder, addiction, definitely had a lot of issues with attachment to men and romantic relationships, always in a relationship with someone very unavailable, or in a fantasy relationship with someone very unavailable. So even though I was really well liked, and I would even say in the popular circles, I hated myself
Mm,
and I hated my body. I hated everything about me.
mm,
I knew that there were things about me that people liked. Like I could see that, and I could see that they were valuable, but I actually still hated myself.
mm. Just want to like breathe into that. I mean, there's so many things that I could go into that I have questions about that I feel like could be so impactful for the audience to hear about. And I think the thing that stands out to me the most that relates to Inner RAE is, I mean, I'm going to ask you about how we getting into your adulthood, but I think before that, what really stood out to me was the 4 or 5 personas you were managing. And then this piece of the story of you hating everything about yourself. And what I'm hearing is, and the disconnect with like your Inner RAE, it's like you weren't hating your Inner RAE. That Inner RAE was allowing you to survive, but you were hating these parts of yourself that you had to create to cover and protect this brilliant, wise inner radiance that didn't quite know how to shine, and feel safe doing that. And so I'm curious if along your way, I mean, you're very in tune. If there was parts of you that knew that was going on, or if it felt super buried inside of you, and if so, then how these patterns continue to play out into your adulthood.
Yeah, I wish I could say that I had any self-awareness
Mm,
during those years. I don't think that I did,
mm,
honestly. I was highly dissociated, and
yeah,
I can have compassion for why. I mean, we don't have to go into it in depth, but I
right.
was a child sexual abuse survivor, and
Mm,
um, my childhood was not safe.
right.
I witnessed some very dangerous things. So I developed the skill of disassociation. And
Hmm.
so I was pretty detached. I mean, you have to be pretty disassociated to have an eating disorder, to be
Right.
honest, because that requires, ignoring all of your bodily signals.
Right. I was just gonna say, can you just for people listening, when I first heard dissociation, I was like, oh wow, I've been doing that my whole life. Can you just for listeners give a little bit of idea of like what dissociation is so we understand and then continue?
So I'm just going to share with you the moment I understood what it was, because of
Perfect.
course there's the clinical definition, which I won't
Right.
get into, but
Hmm.
I remember hearing a story in a support group I was in, and they described it as um, you're going about your day, and for whatever reason, you like hit pause, and then you have to keep going about your day, and then you end, and then you hit play, and then you go back to yourself. And I wish I could say it was that controlled, but when I was learning about disassociation at the time, I was in grad school, and I was like, oh, I don't I that's a problem that I do
Right.
that. Like it didn't even occur to me because that's just how I lived.
Hmm.
Like leaving my body
Yeah.
was the first option in most
Hmm.
situations. And I can now reflexively look back and say, well, I learned that from being sexually abused. And when we're having something horrifying happen to us, and our brains don't and our bodies don't have an escape or a way to understand it or compute it,
Hmm.
um, there's a couple
Leave.
ways to deal with that. But most children disassociate in that
Yep.
moment, and they are able to kind of take their consciousness and float out of their bodies,
Yep.
and so that what is happening to their bodies they can create some distance from because it's too
Hmm.
painful. So
Yep.
that's how I would
Thank you.
describe disassociation.
Yeah. That's should be helpful. Now play.
Oh yeah, let's return.
Let's return.
I forgot what we were talking about, to
We
be
were
honest.
talking about getting into adulthood and how you
Right.
you started to learn. to dissociate?
So, fast forward, I'll just tell the quick version of this story. I got
Yeah.
into 12 colleges, got full rides at all of them. I picked the one that was the furthest away. Ironically, it was a women's college, which the reason that's ironic is I did not like girls or women very much. But I went to a women's college and I proceeded to take all of these personas and literally feed them speed. Because at that point, my alcoholism had progressed enough that I needed to use pharmaceuticals to manage the alcoholism, to manage my high functioning academic self. Right. And so in college, I ended up pursuing a high honors degree in neuroscience and chemistry, which basically means I was doing research in a research lab. I actually published a first author paper, if you're familiar with research, what that means. But I published a couple papers. I wrote a thesis, all of that while being probably one of the bigger partiers in my circles. I used to say I had like my Tuesday drinking friends, my Wednesday drinking friends, my Thursday drinking friends, because I could never let anybody know just how much I was drinking. So that was that persona piece that I continued. And then I had to use, downers or benzos to sleep. And then I had to use uppers, mostly pharmaceutical grade. I wasn't at the time using cocaine or meth or anything like that. Not that I never did any of that, but at that time I was using, classic college drugs, Adderall, Dex, those things, to just keep myself going, to the point that there was a semester where I'd gotten so behind from partying that I spent 2 weeks awake on pharmaceutical speed in order to complete my assignments. And I was hallucinating at the end. Everything was like purple and sideways. So that is how I adapted to college. And I got pretty good grades. I graduated with high honors. Oh, by the way, I also was a swimmer for 3 years. I swam. I was, the head of several organizations. I had a social life. But the uniting thread is that I did not know how to maintain and create healthy relationships with people, not just romantic friendships, relationships with professors, relationships with my family. That part of my life was pretty bleak.
And I feel like, this goes back to the personas, right? When we're not listening to that deep inner voice, it's hard to maintain relationships with those around us, because that relationship with ourselves seems very far buried. Wow. You literally were doing it all and excelling in some degree, but also what I'm hearing is like the stress on your body, on your mind, and on your spirit.
Well, and the next chapter is so interesting because you hear that and you would think, oh, then you went on to do blah, blah, blah. No, what I did with that is I graduated, and like so many of us who had no boundaries growing up, I was too terrified to go into the world. So here I was, I'd graduated. I was like, what's the next structured thing that I can do? And I didn't know what to do. So I moved back home with my parents. My dad at that point had found sobriety. My parents were in couples therapy. It seemed like my family was reconciling and healing, and I was just getting started. So I moved back home. That didn't work out well. All of a sudden, I went from being the hero to the scapegoat, and everything got blamed on me because, well, I was pretty insane at that time. So I did what I knew to do, which was to find a boyfriend and move in with him. And I actually, for a brief period, stopped drinking to make that relationship work, and kind of took on that severe codependent role. But that relationship went down in flames when I started drinking again. And I at that point, I remember looking around my life going, I literally did the exact opposite thing that I would have thought I would have done, which is move back into the darkness after I just had these 4 years of freedom. So at that point, my parents, the one time they kind of intervened, requested that I go see a psychiatrist and a therapist. And that therapist was like, you need to get the hell out of there. I was living in Eastern Kentucky again. I was bartending. There were just no realistic prospects for the kind of person that I had the potential to become. Like there was no one trying to do neuroscience in Maysville, Kentucky. So, not that I didn't even know if that's what I wanted to do. I just knew that I did not know how to evolve in that environment. So I moved to Nashville. I'll try to speed this story along. I moved to Nashville and with like no plan. And my choice to move to Nashville was literally, I took out a map and said to myself, what's far enough away that if I get drunk, I won't drive home to see my ex, because that was always a concern while drunk. And then what is not so far that if I fall on my face and have nowhere to go, I could drive home and live with my parents again, which sounds horrible to me now, but and Nashville was 4.5 hours away. I'd never heard of Nashville, didn't know anything about Tennessee, but I knew that there was a huge university there. So if I wanted to get a doctorate, I could. So I moved to Nashville, and within a year, I got struck sober. And within 3 months of that, I started a PhD. So
can you take us into that lightning strike? What was that? How did that clarity hit you? How did you find that? I mean, Inner RAE shining.
Yeah. I would say that I wish that I could tell you that I earned that. But this is where I do believe it was divine intervention.
Yeah.
I had moved to Nashville. I'd been living there for about a year. I had made this commitment to like only drink high class drinks. I wasn't going to do drugs. I was going to be a cool drinker who, wasn't problematic, because I'd kind of gone downhill when I was back in Kentucky. The drugs had gotten really bad again, all of that. And I was like, so I don't have a crazy boyfriend. I don't have crazy parents. I'm just living my best life. And well, that I was still horrifically miserable. I remember drinking margaritas with these friends and being like, I don't like any of you. I'm so bored. I'm so miserable. And so, getting sober, I woke up one morning after a horrific night of drinking that I had no rationalization for getting drunk. I'd been trying to not drink. I'd been on a 2-week break, gone and gotten wasted, woke up and heard a voice that basically said, I was talking to this voice, which is interesting now because I was atheist at the time. So I don't know what I thought I was talking to, myself, I guess. And this voice was like, hey, can you explain to me why you did that again? And I was like fighting with the voice. And I was like, well, it must have been someone's birthday. And it's like, no, it was no one's birthday. Well, it must have been a holiday. Nope. The last holiday was a few days ago. So and basically what the voice said back to me is like, you got drunk because you're an alcoholic and you're never going to stop. So that was, hey, Annie, sorry. My dog has decided to join. That was the big moment where I literally, the voice told me to call AA, which was interesting. So I called 411, talked to someone in central office. And by 1:00 that day was in my first meeting. And out of respect for the traditions of 12-step, I won't go into it beyond that. But that was my big wake up call, was sitting in a room with a bunch of regular old drunks and listening and going, this is the most real conversation I've heard in a long time. And even though I don't know about this God stuff, like I don't know about any of that, I know that I feel more connected in this messy truth than I have felt in my fun and, party life that I had created for myself. So that was the beginning of me reconnecting to that inner radiant, authentic energy.
Such a beautiful story. I mean, it got me emotional hearing that, because you listening to that voice is courageous, and taking that step to go, so courageous. And I think this brings us into like what it's like now for you. what was it like making that choice, and how was making that choice stayed with you today and every single courageous move you've made?
Okay. How has making that choice stayed with me? Sorry, I lost my flow.
All right.
Sorry, I'd like totally got distracted and lost it.
Let's just you were just getting into your big transition. Your inner RAE spoke to you and you listened.
Yeah.
You went to your first AA meeting and you were listening to that messy truth, and you're standing in it, and it felt real and authentic, and you were ready. Tell us about that.
So, yeah, I think what really, looking back now, struck me about being in those meetings was that it was a bunch of people who had no option but to be authentic. Like being authentic became their lifeline.
Right.
And being able to step into, for probably the first time in my life, like just full permission to have this community where the more authentic I was, the more I was going to heal. And that seemed to be the key. And to me, like, there's a lot of wonderful things that I got out of 12 step. Again, out of respect for the traditions, I'm not going to drop into it a ton. But I'm a big proponent and fan of people finding a path to spirituality that works for them, that I happen to get through joining a 12-step group.
Right.
I kind of say it, for me, it was spirituality for dummies. And so this was the beginning of my journey that I sometimes talk about, of being an atheist scientist to a modern day mystic. That began in the rooms of AA. And so fast forward, how did I get from there to here? I did spend the next 5 years doing research as a neuroscientist at a university in Nashville. And I was getting a doctorate. And what I can tell you is that the more that radiance in me started to wake up, the less I fit into that world. And the more I became a target for people in that world. And this isn't, I'm not here to talk negatively about scientific research communities or even about that institution. But what my story was, that the more I stood in my truth and the more I connected and started to broadcast that radiant, authentic self, the less I was welcome in that community. And going back to something we spoke about earlier, because of my highly skilled ability to disassociate, the way that I left my doctorate was pretty devastating. The
way you left.
The way that I left my doctorate was pretty devastating. So, I think often when I look back on my story, I at times when I look back at my story, I could say, oh, I wish I hadn't put myself through that. And what I know is that I had to be in enough pain to leave something that was really, upon reflection, like, yeah, alcohol and drugs saved my life.
Mm-hmm.
But the framework of how I survived the reality that I was born into was that I was a scientist. I was going to control my environment. I was going to do experiments to figure out what these universal laws to live by are. And that, in order for me to leave the sciences to eventually find myself where I am today, it had to be so incredibly painful, because it was the only thing I clung on to. It was the only thing from my childhood that felt safe, was this idea that I could figure things out, that all the answers could come through here. Right. But what the 12 step was teaching me, and other therapy and other groups that I was in was teaching me, is that actually, this is actually my favorite quote about the brain that I'll then apply to spirituality. If we could fully understand the brain, right? If it was simple enough, that's what it is. If the brain were simple enough for us to understand it, we would be too simple to understand it.
Yeah.
And so the further up I got in science, and the more I came to find out that we actually have no idea what is actually happening, that it's actually quite mystical and quite magical, the more I came to understand that God, the universe, all of that, science was just a limited human explanation for the unexplainable.
Yeah.
And I woke up and became this profound mystic 5 years into my doctorate. I mean, it's evolved since then.
Totally.
But that was the beginning of me waking up to the idea that maybe control was not the answer. Maybe control was actually limiting. And so what that looked like was panic attacks. You know, my eating disorder had come back pretty severely. I was what I would define as orthorexic, anorexic, exercise bulimic. So while I wasn't using drugs or alcohol, I was addicted to this idea that I was, you know, when I would walk into a room, people would say, oh, Erin Watt is the smartest person I know. And that was one of my drugs of choice, was being this impressive neuroscientist, researcher, smart person who also, by the way, looks perfect and knows exactly how you should eat, exactly how you should exercise, exactly how you should live your life. And if you would just listen to her, your life would be perfect. Very, very addicting to be that persona. And it almost killed me. So that way of living brought me to my knees. And that to me was probably even more of a, like, my inner radiant authentic energy was like, this is not your truth. This is not your truth. And because I've always been a seeker, and I've always been like, I gotta really get that scientist in me, right? It's not a bad thing, has always been a seeker, that if I continue to seek, I would find that what I was doing was limiting. So quit my PhD. And then I was like, God, what do I do now? Well, I did what pretty much everyone I know and now in long-term recovery has done at some point, which I started working in the mental health and addiction treatment industry. And without dropping too much into that, I found myself being really drawn to, at first, more women, and women who were chronically relapsing because of relationship issues. And at the time, I was doing my own work around attachment, you know, what they call, and what I was calling at the time, love addiction. I don't love that phrase anymore, and we have an episode about that. But looking at attachment-based issues in relationships and how that contributes to chronic relapsing. And I ended up meeting someone who defined themselves as a relational expert. I'm really going quickly through the story here. I became a coach. because everyone was telling me, oh, become a therapist, become a therapist. But I've been wounded in academia. So the idea of going back to school, I would rather have like, you know, jumped out of a plane vomiting. Like I
Right.
just like nothing
You're
about
like,
that.
no.
Nothing about that sounded
Yeah.
appealing at all to me. So
Yeah.
I became a coach and met this woman who was a self-proclaimed expert in relationships. She taught me some really cool things. We co-created a lot of curriculum together and built a coaching company together. I learned that I'm a natural leader. I mean, I think you can hear that in my story, but
Yeah.
I really started to step into the fact that I was a leader and a teacher and a trainer. And eventually that partnership came to an end. The end of 2019, I did what I knew to do, which was retreat back into the mental health and addiction treatment space. Got it for the last 3 years, spent time refining, rebuilding, nurturing this vision, which eventually has become Inner RAE.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's where I am today. And there's a lot in between, but did that get us current?
That did get us current. And I want this to keep going on for hours. Like I have so many questions. And I think what would be a really good place to end with or lead us into a closing is, so you talked about how a lot of your journey was top down, mind focused.
Mm-hmm.
You went from scientist to modern day mystic. How, I mean, I know from being a coach within this Inner RAE curriculum, it's a beautiful blend of accessing the brilliance of our mind, but really seeding in the radiance of our heart and our soul. And I'm wondering how you blended it to get to this point, and how that blend plays out in coaching clients, and how that feels to you now, having this balance between the two, because the war is really the challenging part of all of it. So how did you get your mind and your heart and your radiance to be on the same page, working together versus fighting each other?
Well, what I would say is that for many years, I just led with my mind.
Mm.
Like, I'm going to be honest, that was always my lead. And that makes sense when you hear my story.
Right.
And what I would find is I would lead with that. And then I guess it was my radiant, authentic energy was kind of whispering
Mm-hmm.
me to drop in more to my heart. And
Right.
Upon application of what I was learning, when I did it from my mind, it helped people. But when one of the things I noticed was when I was training a lot of these coaches at this other company, so many of them, they were all brilliant, but so many of them had these, I think the word I want to use is these like never ending, abundant heart centers. And I did not resonate with that. I'm going to be honest. I was like, man, they have way more to give in that area than I do. And then I would watch them express the curriculum in a way that never occurred to me, to be completely honest. And honestly, it was watching them and then trying it out with my clients. Not that my clients are experiments, but like, honestly, like dropping into, well, what would it be like to be more heart-centered in my approach?
Right.
What would it be like to meditate in a session with my clients? What would it be like to remind people that they are loved by a divine force in every session? And so I just started playing around with it. And by working with my clients, and then also me doing my own therapy, me reading books, developing friendships with people that are the opposite of me, and seeing the beauty and the grace and how they carry themselves and how they recover. Honestly, it's been a collective effort, and the radiant, authentic energy in me has been like, ooh, I like how Katie did that. Oh, I really like how my friend Jessica does that. Or, wow, the way my friend Robin expressed that was so different and not a way that I would do it. But how can I learn from that and
Right.
expand on that. So yeah, it was a collective effort. I think me left in a vacuum would have written a textbook. And it might have helped some people, but I would say that Inner RAE really is an amalgamation of all of the amazing, wonderful, heart-centered people I've known along the way who have taught me how to drop into my body and my heart and my soul, and therefore take this brilliant way of thinking that would be completely useless if it wasn't also connected to the heart. So
Right.
yeah, thank you. Anyone who's listening, you know who you are. Thank you. Thank you for loving me when I did not know, not only did I not know how to love myself, I literally didn't know that that kind of love was available. And the people in my life today continue to amaze me at the kind of, let me think how to say it, the infinite, there's no such thing as too much love.
Right.
Did not know that. Did not know that, but I get to experience that in my relationships today.
It's so beautiful. I mean, there's so many pieces of this that speak to the heart of the clients that we have, and all of our journeys through listening to that inner radiance, leading us deeper into our relationships, leading us deeper into love. It's so beautiful, and it's so inspiring to hear you talk about your story. And I think that the other thing that's really beautiful too is when someone's speaking from the heart fully authentically, it can't be copied, but that energy can be felt, and it leads you and it guides you into your own authenticity. And so you can try on sitting in that heart space, and all you have is your own energy to lead you, and you find the courage to do so through having inspiring and empowering relationships around you, people who are doing that. And I know from my seat, you're that for me. And it's just beautiful how it all comes back around. Is there anything else that you wished that I'd asked that you want to jump into? Is there anything else that you want to share before we close out? I mean, I'm thinking that next episode we dive deeper into a couple of themes that came out to me that I think would be really impactful, but curious.
Well, I think it would bring it really full circle to say that when I first started to awaken, right? When I came to 12-step, people would say, people would tell me they love me or they'd want to hug me. And I was like, don't effing touch me. And there's no way you could love me. You don't even know me. Whereas today I catch myself, like sometimes I have to hold myself back from telling my clients, hey, I love you. Right. Yeah. Like, it's just like, it's so automatic for me now. And it's authentic, totally, when I say it now. So I guess I just wanted to share that I've come a long way, and I plan to continue to go a long way from here. So, I know that you would love to dive into more of my story, but my hope is in our next episode, we're actually going to hear from you and your story. And my hope is that throughout this podcast, yes, we'll have guests and we'll speak about topics, but I will have an opportunity to share more of my story. And also, if you're listening and there was anything in my story that felt curious or interesting to you, give us that feedback and we'll do an episode on it. So thanks for your beautiful questions, Katie. And I'll hand it back to you.
All right. Well, everybody, I just want to give Erin a big virtual hug because that was awesome. And thank you for sharing all of that with us. It was a privilege to listen and an honor to hold space for you to share your story, because the world needs to hear more of these inspiring stories and know that true transformation exists and that inner radiance is beyond powerful. So with that, thank you all for listening.
Were we gonna put in that fun thing that we were going to do?
Oh, yeah. Ooh,
okay. Okay. Go for it. Go for it. Do you have it?
I do.
Okay.
All right. So we're always going to ask this question that I'm about to ask Erin at the end. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay. So name someone in the public eye who's broadcasting their inner way and inspiring you to live your most radiant, authentic life. Go.
So I think in honor of me telling my story,
Mm-hmm.
I am going to say that that person is Brene Brown, because she, like me, was from the academic research world, and she managed to convince a bunch of academics to talk about vulnerability and love and trust and all of those things. And I know that when I read her first book, The Gifts of Imperfection, it profoundly shifted and changed me. So for today's episode, my answer is the wonderful, amazing, talented Brene Brown.
Everybody who's listening, check out Brene Brown if you haven't already.
God, my dog is really wanting to participate in this. I don't know if you can hear her.
I could hear her a little bit. I love that. The spirit, it's coming through, and she came through in very interesting times in our episode today. So
yeah.
I think that's quite special. I was paying attention. All right. So thank you all for listening. Should we
see you next week?
Yeah. See you next week.